So with that said, I would now like to pass over to our special invited speaker, Tony Woodbury, who's come from University of Texas at Austin. I'd maybe just like to say one further thing about the connection, which is that a couple of years after I got back to the ANU, Alan and myself organised a special course for which we invited Tony to come and teach on language and verbal art. It was a totally memorable course, funded sort of on a shoestring, but that had an effect on a lot of people. And that was, I guess, that reflected this shared interest they both had. That was at a time where the Chan Tales project was in full flight, and Tony has worked on many issues there, although that's not the primary focus of Tony's talk today, but it does reflect a number of other interests of animals. So thank you very much, Tony, for coming, and thanks to you all again for coming to celebrate this day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It was really hard to tear myself away from the 40-degree heat of Austin to come here. Let's see. Just getting started here. I think I first met Alan in fall of 1973 in Jim McCauley's Generative Syntax 1 class at the University of Chicago. I was an undergrad taking as much linguistics as I could, and Alan was a graduate student in the new joint program in anthropology and linguistics. Macaulay's way of teaching was to build day by day a more and more elaborate grammar of English centered on quasi-logical form type underlying representations and a growing list of ordered transformations. Alan was the smartest kid in the class. How did Alan know, I would ask myself, to connect X with Y, or to realize that Z was a counterexample? These were the kinds of things I was marveling at. Alan, by that time, was deeply committed to studying language in its cultural context and to working on language in Australia. Like several of his fellow graduate students, Alan was, for me, an indispensable informal teacher. I remember Alan explaining kinship systems, explaining Jacobsonian poetics, explaining why purely introspective philosophical approaches to pragmatics and speech act theory weren't enough, and all that while also being a grammarian. Probably at least partly at Alan's urging, in spring 1974, we took Michael Silverstein's seminar on ergativity, following Michael's racing mind through a massively unfolding landscape of strange patterns and even stranger harmonies through those patterns. And that was along with a dazzling group that included Jerry Sadok and Alan's fellow graduate students Dee Holiski, James Fox, Mike Legaly, and the late Tom Smith-Stark, who much later became my mentor in Mesoamerican linguistics. I also think it may have been Alan that pointed me to Paul Friedrich and James Redfield's year-long class on Homeric Greek, and especially through Paul, to the world of grammar, poetics, and individual linguistic imagination. A few years ago, Alan wrote a wonderful, if sober, assessment that Nick just talked about of the encounter between anthropology and linguistics from 1984 to the present, its successes as well as its too frequent estrangements. Alan, along with our mentors, but quite a bit fewer people more recently, has been a consummate practitioner of both, rooted deeply in both fieldwork and theory. Alan has made broad contributions to each discipline separately, but also to the integration of them both in work that amounts to a massive program to integrate questions of linguistic diversity with facets of human practice, cognition, and art as studied within a wide range of human sciences centered around linguistics and anthropology. Today, I want to discuss a problem that I can't solve, but whose nature is raised and perhaps whose solutions are inspired by the deep and pioneering work of Alan over the course of his long and rich career. And this is a problem that comes when seeking to document a language with a view towards capturing its lexico-grammatical genius. And by that I mean the kind of eclectic and often unique mix of different properties that sensitive descriptive linguists are looking for when they are preparing grammars and dictionaries. And this could be the many different variations on being non-configurational, or on being polysynthetic, or on being tonal, or many contexts where these various variations are found, these seemingly sometimes adventitious groupings of many different characteristics. So how do these configurations hang together? That is, how do they persist in time, and how do they coordinate to form different patterns of use and or fashions of speaking? And to that question, I completely don't have the answer, but I think that Alan's work points the way to exploring the different ways that lexicogrammar and speech practices can grow, can and do grow alongside their speakers. So basically, I'll organize my talk like this. We'll talk a little bit about this idea of lexico-grammatical genius and some questions it poses. Then I want to talk about Alan's various explorations in how lexicogrammar and speech practices have grown together, and how those might point the way towards some solutions to some of the questions that are raised that way. So, to begin with, most linguists have encountered this term, the genius of language, through Edward Sapire's book, Language. At times, it's a pretty prosaic notion. It just means a language particular rule. So he talks about the application of the principle of concord varies considerably according to the genius of the particular language. That's nothing too transcendental. But he also has a deeper meaning for his term. In this quotation, he says, "For it must be obvious to anyone who has thought about the question at all, or has felt something of the spirit of a foreign language, that there is such a thing as a basic plan, a certain cut to each language. This type or plan or structural genius of the language is something much more fundamental, much more pervasive than any single feature of it that we can mention, nor can we gain an adequate idea of its nature by a mere recital of sundry facts that make up the grammar of the language." Sapir basically had an agenda in his use of this notion, and in particular, he had a novel typological scheme that he presented in the same book that was centered on the interrelationship of morphological function as stem, derivation, or inflection with degrees of lexical semantic concreteness. And his goal was to identify and explain tendencies of languages to undergo changes in accordance with their special structural geniuses, which he called drift. So he says it would seem that linguistic features are easily thinkable apart from each other, that seem to have no necessary connection in theory, have nevertheless a tendency to cluster or follow together in the wake of some deep controlling impulse to form that dominates their drift. If, therefore, we can only be sure of the intuitive similarity of two languages, of their possession of the same submerged form feeling, we need not be too much surprised to find that they seek and avoid certain linguistic developments in common. Someday, it may be that we shall be able to read from symptoms of these form feelings the great underlying ground plans. So this special project, notwithstanding, Sapir's use of the phrase had quite a zing, and it had a considerable influence on grammar writing and other descriptive linguistic writing. So in the introduction to a book on grammar writing, Nick Evans and Alan Dench take up the theme saying an emphasis on systemic integration and on recognizing the overall architecture of a language has dominated linguistics since the structuralist era. The idea of an essential genius of a language drives descriptive grammarians to look for a characteristic overall vowel plan that makes sense of the language's particularities in an integrated way. At the same time, grammarians need to keep an open mind on how far traits are in fact free to vary independently or following the structural dictum hold each other together. Karen Rice, in a paper in that volume with a nice title, Let the Language Tell Its Story, the Role of Linguistic Theory in Writing Grammars, says that in the largest sense, a grammar should express what Sapir refers to as the genius of a language. The genius of a language, a phrase used often by Sapir, is what the grammarian ultimately hopes to capture. What is this genius of a language? How can one encapsulate it in a grammar? So for our purposes, I think a framing that we could give to Karen Rice's question might be this, that we could say that when we're engaged in language documentation and description, we encounter language, our own language or somebody else's language, as natural speech embedded in a set of communicative practices and habits, and as knowledge and ability that the speaker has. We could assume that that all of this is the complex product of human ingenuity and historical accident, and that is also shaped by tendencies in how we process and use language by our biological capacities and limitations. So can we find among these peculiarities a system or set of systems in which, as Millet said, everything hangs together, tout se tient? Can we identify pervasive and possibly unique features and interrelationships? So just to give really quickly a few examples that are probably pretty familiar to everyone, the idea of non-configurationality. So Ken Hale, in a series of papers about Woolbury, talks about the grammar of Woolbury exhibiting a number of properties which have come to be associated with the typological label non-configurational, including, among others, free word order, the use of syntactically discontinuous expressions, and the extensive use of null anaphora. Another, I think, very nice paper in that theme is by Jeffrey Heath, in which he argues that in Nungubuyu Ubui, it goes Woolbury a few paces better. It's even more non-configurational. And eventually, as you examine these ideas, what comes to the fore are the many different variations on these so-called themes. Another example would be polysynthesis. So the recent volume that Nick and others edited on polysynthesis shows a tremendous, enormous amount of variation on this theme of building up very complex morphological structures. And just to take an example that I think sort of pursues the genius idea quite nicely is Wally Chaffe's recent Grammar of Seneca, where he talks about polysynthesis and its connection to a kind of a syntax that's based on semantic amplification of one big polysynthetic word after another. Another example would be verb serialization and the relationship that it has to lexical inventories. So in particular, a paper by Andrew Pauly that whose title was modified in another wonderful paper by Alan that we might be able to talk about a little bit later. Andrew Pauly's title is A Language Which Defies Description by Ordinary Means. And he talks about a very unique relationship between the paucity of verb vocabulary and the tremendous stringing together of verbs that take place. But also he makes a very important comment. He says that mastering the genius of the language, he uses the term, he uses it to mean acquiring what might be called idiomatic competence, knowing how things are said by native speakers, not just grammatically, but idiomatically or normally. And this actually sort of goes back to a use of the term genius of language that goes well before Sapir, that had to do with the kinds of expressions that people use in different languages. So you can't, just knowing the language isn't enough to know how to say things in ways that people will accept. Another example would be tonal morphology. So this is a rubric under which many different kinds of things can come. I've been very closely associated with a group of people working on Chetino languages that have a lot of tonal morphology. In Emiliana Cruz's dissertation, she talks about tone as a component in stem formation, sound symbolism, grammatical classification, and inflection, and the kinds of thematic resonances that you get with tone doing all of those different things in a grammar. That would be another example of this on the phonological side. Aerial packages, too, might be thought of in these terms. So the work of Campbell, Kaufman, and Smith-Stark on Mesoamerica as a linguistic area talks about a complex of phonological, morphological, syntactic, and lexical properties that are stable across the Mesoamerican language area, and which form a kind of a bundle or a package. So what are some recurrent themes here? There are some favored properties that you will find. So free word order, discontinuous constituents, verb serialization, morphological tone. In the context of that, you often can find that the communicative work that needs to be done motivates further properties, sometimes fairly unusual properties if the founding properties are unusual. But property bundles might still also not be particularly motivated. They may just be adventitious groupings of things. Another theme is the independence of predominant linguistic properties and predominant communicative practice. You can't necessarily tell one from the other. Another would be persistence. So polysynthesis in Yupik Inuit languages is remarkably persistent throughout the entire family. It's always set up the same way, and the reconstructions of stems to stems and affixes to affixes are always very, very nice and neat, showing that the system hasn't changed very much. Another example of persistence would be these aerial packages. So some theoretical questions that are raised are, to what extent are such pervasive plans limited by our biological capacities or by the shape of linguistic meaning or by general communicative and discursive functions? So if the answer to that is less than you might think, then how do so many of these different configurations hang together? That is, how do they persist in time? And even if, let's say, the configurations are statistically rare or contrary to formal or functional prediction, how do they stay in place? So I don't know the answer, but I really think that that for finding answers to these kinds of questions, we can look to the sorts of explorations that Alan has done so compellingly, and I think make some real headway. So I now want to just kind of go over a lot of the, just kind of describe what I see as the landscape of things that Alan has contributed in this direction, and it's quite diverse. It's very diverse, and this doesn't even begin to touch so much of what all else Alan has done, but I'm trying to focus on what I see as most germane to these questions, and it, even so, is quite a range of things. So I've sort of picked out 4 themes that I'm going to be talking about. So one is lexico grammar, fashions of speaking and their relationship to linguistic ideology and to other aspects of culture. Another is lexico grammar in relation to verbal art, rhetorical efficacy, and individual imagination. The third is discreteness and equivalence in lexico grammar, in verbal art, and in worldview. And the fourth is sociality, markedness, and scales of complexity as design features of lexical grammar and language use. So before sort of digging into that, I just want to kind of review, again, because it shows his remarkable resourcefulness and diversity of some of the data modes that Alan works in. So he engages in linguist-type, higher-level linguistic analysis of lexical grammar, looking for resonances and harmonies across patterns, looking for succinct ways of explaining what's really going on, as we say. Evidence of ideology through ethnographic observation and analysis and participation. Textual, pragmatic, and ethnographic analysis of poetic and political performance, and longitudinal data gathering of child-caretaker interactions. So, starting with the first of the themes, lexico grammar, fashions of speaking, and linguistic ideology and culture, I really think that his 1990 paper that is cited here is a great place to start to dig into that aspect of Alan's work. And in the beginning, he makes, I think, a very important comment that sort of links up to the questions that I've been asking. He says, in common with Worth 1956, I believe that the best way to study the relationship between language structure and other aspects of social life is by looking for what he called fashions of speaking, global complexes of features that cut across the typical grammatical classifications so that such a fashion may include lexical, morphological, syntactic, and otherwise systematically diverse means coordinated in a certain frame of consistency. And I think that Worf's notion fits that pre-Sapir usage of genius. There's a very nice paper by Edward Stankiewicz that traces the term from the Renaissance on. Seemingly, quoting Alan now in this paper, but what he's about in this paper is two seemingly disparate aspects of Ungarenin and English grammar are related to each other and to aspects of Aboriginal and standard average European linguistic ideology. And here he's following a formulation of Michael Silverstein in a paper called Language Structure and Linguistic Ideology. I could elaborate on that, but I think I won't. So for English, and this gets kind of complicated, so please bear with me. For English, direct versus indirect discourse and several instances of what loosely you might call de re versus de dicto anaphora co-occur with ideological traditions distinguishing words versus meaning and action. So this would be a kind of a connection within the sphere of standard average European languages where these linguistic distinctions as well as these ideological distinctions seem to be heavily present. And comparing that with Ungarenin, where there's a lack of these distinctions in the linguistic system, so you don't use indirect speech, you always use something that reads to us as more like direct speech. And that is alongside an ideology where wording and meaning are understood by speakers as being fundamentally merged. So basically you say what you're saying is what you mean, and what you mean is what you say, and there's not so much of a kind of a dichotomizing of that. This then would be it's a pretty bold stride into the idea of connecting what's going on in people's worlds with what's going on in their languages. Another paper that kind of follows along that same program, adding another example, is this 2001 paper cited here. And just to give you a sense of the subtlety of his thought about these things, I want to try to calc, if I can, using English, the point that he's trying to make. So he's basically saying that English versus Ungarenin and also Yidin, another Australian language, fashions of speaking, they're track with the treatment of reported speech, and hence the associated ideologies. In other words, you have a separation in English, not of reported and direct speech, and not in Ungaremin. So what he's talking about works like this. So in English, we have this complement-taking lexeme try, right? You try to do such and such. And in Ungaremin, you don't have a verb meaning try. You put the idea together with a couple of different pieces that are in some parts dependent on this idea about direct speech. So basically what you say is X says that it might not happen, which is expressed by a particle, that I will do verb. So, for example, if you want to say he tried to spear a kangaroo, it's he says that it might not happen yet. He says it might not happen yet, but I, meaning he, will in the future spear a kangaroo, meaning he tried to spear a kangaroo. And so it's this kind of just really, really semantically subtle and I think very perspicuous analysis that Alan is pursuing these cases. He also comments on and takes as an inspiration a paper by Ken Hale. This was actually for a Festschrift for Ken. A very, very interesting paper on these kinds of issues that Ken wrote, that's cited at the bottom here. As a final example, Alan has a very thorough paper about ethnosyntax as it arises in Kuwaru. And he's basically making a distinction between a broader ethnosyntax versus narrow ethnosyntax, where the narrow is built directly into the encoding in the language in some way, whereas in the broad case, you're basically looking at how the language is used in ways that reflect kinds of distinctions that are culturally defined. So, for example, he talks about the use of singular and dual speech act pronouns as they're used to refer to social groupings. So you actually would say I when you're referring to a certain type of group that you belong to, or we when you're talking to, we in the dual when you're talking about a pairing of groups where you belong within that pairing. And so in these ways, syntactic kinds of distinctions are taken up in cultural kinds of interpretations and contexts. So then taking all of this together, I know I've been kind of racing through it. How do Alan's dramatic and specific linkages of lexico grammar, of fashions of speaking, and of linguistic ideology and other aspects of culture help us to understand this idea of lexico-grammatical genius? Well, I would say that one of the things you could say is that they tend to generate patterns of what I've elsewhere called form-dependent expression. That is, any case where the arbitrary forms and patterns of a language are harnessed in a way to constitute specific kinds of communicative purpose or content. And we see this becomes a live issue in contexts of radical language shift, of language endangerment, because as soon as the lexico-grammatical undergirding is threatened or starts to fall apart, then the maintenance of the expressive forms also starts to fall apart, or is likely to fall apart, or will have to do some very, very complex refiguring in order to seat itself in the new lexico-grammatical context. So likewise, we could consider the presence, especially of fashions of speaking, as cues for their own maintenance or continuity. So for example, the lexicalization of pairings, I didn't actually describe this, I will later, of pairings of concepts in Kuwaru compounds, and this same practice of pairing that Alan has talked about in the parallelism of political oratory, could be mutually reinforcing. So now I want to turn to lexico grammar in relation to verbal art, also to rhetorical efficacy, and to individual imagination. And here I'm going to be talking about two of Alan's papers, the first of which is cited here. This actually is just the tip of the iceberg. As you know from Nick's talk, there's a whole book on the verbal art traditions, the Tom Yaya Kange epic narrative in Kuwaru that Alan has been a part of, and many other papers too, making many very unique contributions. But one of so this paper that I've cited here is one of a number that focus on this discourse genre, particularly Tom Yaya Kange, which is a kind of sung metrical epic narrative, and focuses also on, to some extent, on political oratory. Alan argues that this genre of that the metrical structure of this genre has grown alongside ideologies and aesthetic sensibilities that allow for a sense of convergence between sound shape and word, and provides an arena for personal excellence and charisma and power as you dazzle everybody, bowl everybody over with your epic performance. He compares this with ecologies of linguistic sound practice and ideology nearby in Kaluli that Steve Feld describes as overlapping and alternation of layered parts and sounds in coordinated, non-discrete textures. Just a kind of joint creation of walls of sound in a kind of environment where there isn't a lot of individual assertion and competitiveness. And Alan argues that this socially based kind of analysis, socially and aesthetically based analysis, accounts better for metrics in Kuwaru than linking metrics to an awareness of literacy, which was a hypothesis that Dennis Tedlock had about metered kinds of performance, that it had to be either in literate societies or societies that were well aware of literate societies, that not being the case, obviously, in the highlands of New Guinea. Another paper, this for a Festschrift for our late teacher Paul Friedrich, takes up the individual qualities in the Tom Yaya Kanga verbal performance of three different men. And of one of them, Kopia Noma, he compares his oratory in a speech, compares to the Tom Yaya performance, his oratory in a speech that's made to arrange the payment of war debts, so a kind of a delicate situation of trying to figure out who owes whom what and who's going to pay whom what, pointing out Noma's uses of pair-based parallelism, prosody, and metaphor in order to create his rhetorical, to reach his rhetorical goals. So in writing of Noma, Alan writes, he was extraordinarily interconnected with and open to the politics in the real world of that time and place, and uncommonly sensitive to verbal nuances, to the word in a way bringing together the kinds of sensibilities that are involved in political oratory and in poetry, that having been a theme also for Paul Friedrich. Now, again, for this part of this theme of Alan's work, let's ask again, how do Alan's considerations of this theme shed light on this hanging together of properties that the genius idea is concerned with? So, a couple of suggestions. I think that they broaden our scope for linguistic explanation beyond a frame of language for reference and predication and into other dimensions, or what Jacobson would have called other functions of language. And they emphasize a kind of a dynamic and performance-centered and individually centered kind of locus for linguistic invention, not just sort of looking at things that are sort of set in stone. Now, the third area that I wanted to raise is the question of, and this is a more sort of analytical and philosophical framing of discreteness and equivalence in lexical grammar and in verbal art, social interaction, and worldview. And this is something that comes out in a wonderful paper by Alan, cited here from 2014, where he shows the parallelistic juxtaposition of two languages, Kuwaro and Tokpisin, in child caregiver interactions, and compares it to a kind of metaphorical juxtaposition of worlds, of the modern world and the mythical world, in one of the Kuwaro epic performances that he took up in the Friedrich article. And so he's basically looking at the question of putting together two different things that are distinct and juxtaposing them. So he's, in general, and this is something that he develops in a number of the papers, there's a kind of a theme that's running through all of the work on Kuwaro discussed so far, and it's a pervasive aesthetic of pairing that embraces parallelism, of course, also the paired metrical lines and paired half melodies that occur in the Kuwaro, but also in epic plot structuring, and it also extends to pairings of social and political units. Political units come in pairs in association with each other in the kinds of social formations that he has written about. And also in lexical compounds. So all of these different kinds of settings where particular framings of pairing and the semantics of pairing get carried out. So we could now, just to try and be clear, talk about what we mean by equivalence, discreteness, and I was going to talk about, stereotyping, but I don't think I'll have time. So equivalence is understood in Jakobson's broad sense as any two or more expressions juxtaposed via parallelism. They could, for example, be synonyms or opposites or parts of a list, but in Kuwaro, asymmetry is avoided. For example, juxtaposing hypernyms with hyponyms is avoided. Equivalence among entities presupposes their discreteness, right? So the contrast of this Kaluli wave-like sounding versus the Tam-Yaya regimented metrics is one example of discrete versus, of non-discrete versus discrete. Another would be the presence versus the absence of indirect quotation versus the lack of that, or likewise the presence or absence of a word versus meaning dichotomy. So even so, as noted, these highly general themes can be construed in different ways and with further constraints in lexical grammar, verbal art, social action, and worldview. And so that's basically how this then ties into the specific accounts given for particular practices. Now finally, you can ask the question, how do Alan's notions of discreteness and equivalence shed light on the hanging together of properties? Here I would say basically indirectly. I mean, I see it as these as design features in a kind of general theoretical framework that's very cross-modal and that's allowing for the integration of lexicogrammar with other dimensions of social action. And this takes us to our next and final topic, sociality and markedness as design features of lexicogrammar and of language use. So in another 2014 paper, Alan argues for the primordial human speech situation based on human sociality, so the triadic engagement of interactants attending to something. So always with a kind of token reflexive pronominal system, so that you are I, so that you are I when you speak, and I am you when you speak. So basically from this kind of underpinning that's burnt into the lexico-grammatical system of every language, we can kind of take sociality as a sort of a beginning point. And whoops. He also talks about typification of indexicality, that is, as forms of address and as register, and the typification in discourse via parallelism across speaker contributions in conversation. Final paper that I'm going to say a little bit about is a paper, quite recent one, talking about dependency and relative determination in language acquisition. So using his longitudinal child-caregiver interactions in Kuwaro, he argues roles of markedness, of scales of complexity, and of and patterns of internal congruence as being factors in what makes a child learn something earlier versus learning something later. So he focuses in the phonological domain on 4 lateral sounds of graded complexity. Having that many lateral sounds and having such weird lateral sounds are typological rarities, but he argues that that the acquisition follows a pattern that is explained in terms of standard ideas of markedness. Likewise, he talks about graded levels of complexity of verbal constructions and finds the same thing. So again, how do Alan's notions of sociality and markedness as design features shed on this hanging together of properties? Again, indirectly as design features in his general theoretical framework for discussing lexical grammar, but also in the case of laterals, it's particularly germane since the size of the inventory, the presence of the stop plus Bueller lateral complex segments are really very rare typologically and yet are persistent and part of a New Guinea aerial bundle. So their acquisition observes a pattern of acquisition that follows from markedness theory, but certainly the substance itself is pretty unusual. So summarizing all of that, I've just kind of put together the sort of general lessons that I see in each of these different areas. But rather than sort of recite that, I think I want to just quickly, as a sort of a coda, give an example of how I think Alan's work might point the way. And I'm going to talk about a little stretch of prayer in the Chatino of San Juan Quiaiche in Oaxaca, Mexico. This is a variety of a shallow language family called Chatino. It's an Automanguean family. It's a family within Automanguean, within Zapotecan. It is spoken in one village called San Juan Quiaiche, you see here. And the prayer was written about by Ilaria Cruz in a paper that you see cited here from 2009, spoken early in the morning when the elders had gathered to go around to different sacred sites and to visit other old people with these prayers on the first of, or at a particular time in the month. So what I want to do is examine this text with Alan's concerns in mind, especially its instantiations of Chatino lexico grammar and Mesoamerican poetics and syncretic Mesoamerican and Roman Catholic ritual protocol. So let's just take a look at this. So we have this is just sort of a part of the prayer. We have the Chatino here, the little numbers are for tones, they've got a lot of them. And then Ilaria's translations are on the right. And you can see the pattern of parallelism in the English, and it's even more striking, I think, actually, in the Chatino. So what we have here, just to recite it, this is our care, this was the way of our fathers, this was the way of our mothers, this was the way of the elder men, this was the way of the elder women. When the time came, when the daylight came, when their hands they asked, with their hands they asked, with their mouths they asked. And if you kind of go to the Chatino, you can see that the parallelism really, really quite striking. So this whole set of introduction, this is the way of, is very, very clearly repeated. This basically is sort of comes the hour, comes the light, asks for by hand, asks for by mouth. Moving on, we get, they prostrated themselves and they knelt down. That's actually much more parallelistic. It's basically stand with bended knees, stand on the knees. Then in the name of God, Holy Jesus, Holy Soul, meaning the Holy Spirit, the elder men, the elder women, speak out strongly for all these hours, for all these days. So the parallelism is very clear, but I want to point out a couple of different features of it. The first one is something that I'm going to call constituent cloning. So this is kind of an idea that William Bright, I think, formulated pretty well in a paper in 1990 on classical Nahuatl discourses that had been written. So the idea is basically this, that as you speak, and Ilaria has formulated this as an explanation for how these guys are so fluent with this kind of parallelism. They just tear through it. It's always uttered at breakneck speed. Basically what you do is you come to a constituent and you decide, shall I repeat this constituent or shall I not repeat it? And so either you do or you don't. So you get to, this is our care. Oh, I guess I'll repeat it. This is the way of our fathers. Then you repeat, this is the way of our mothers. This is the way of our elder men. This is the way of elder women. And you have a particular part within it that you're varying, but otherwise you're repeating. But if you follow this whole thing, you can see that it kind of meanders along the track of a long, complex sentence or oration. So you could sort of truncate it by removing the repetitions. This is our care. This is the way of our fathers, let's say. When the time came, with their hands they asked. They prostrated themselves in the name of God, Holy Jesus, Holy Soul, the elder men. Speak out strongly. There's one that isn't, that's the only one in this particular stretch that isn't repeated. For all these hours, for all these days. And so basically it's a kind it sometimes generates quite complex looking patterns, but if you look at it at the constituent level, it's pretty tidy. So that's one thing. I've formulated that here, but basically we don't need to go into the details. But just one comment that I'd like to make is that I think that the cloning is actually helped along by the fact that the language is strongly head initial. You're always basically on the downbeat as you're doing a new repetition, as it were. So the cloning and the head initial syntax might be seen as being mutually supporting. And this, of course, gets back into our question of persistence. Another point is that the couplets and quatrains, that mainly you see couplets and quatrains, but there's one telling place where you don't, right? You see in the name of God, Holy Jesus, and Holy Soul. So basically this syncretic religious traditional Catholic prayer is sort of taking on board a triplet in this one place, following a kind of rhetorical figure embedded from more standard Catholic ritual. Another thing we could talk about are canonical, what we would call Diffracismos. So basically, usually pairs where the two elements juxtaposed in parallelism kind of add up to something more than the sum of their parts. So father and mother appear here, hour and daylight, bent knees and knees form figures, and these basically are a kind of very, very, very general and broad pattern, sometimes the same ones, sometimes different ones, across Mesoamerica, and part of the article that Campbell et al. wrote on that subject. And then another thing that's really striking in the prayers that Ilaria talks about are the juxtaposition of kind of complete lexical sets. So there's a fairly widespread four-way lexical set for body position that basically is to lie. In the Chatino version, it basically is to lie, to sit on the floor, to sit on a kind of a raised platform, and to stand. And so those four are always juxtaposed in a kind of a line from down to up or from up to down in a lot of the parallelism. So again, here you see the lexico grammar being kind of showcased through the practice of the rhetorical system. So basically, I think from there, I think we can see that Alan's way of thinking about things is a very productive way to talk about these kinds of phenomena. And I think we have a long way to go in charting the boundaries and possibilities of lexical grammar when it's fully appreciated for its genius. But at this point, I think we should thank, and I would like to thank Alan Rumsey for such a wonderful opus and such wonderful guidance.
Thank you, Tony, for doing such an amazing job of leading us through so much of Alan's work and relating it to questions that we all need to think more about. We've got about 10 minutes for discussion, so who wants to go first?
Hi, Deborah McDougall. I was really struck, I really liked the way you were talking about this hanging together in Alan's work, because I'm on very firmly on the anthropology side. And I was thinking as you were talking about how that always provisional, kind of not closed, but sort of multimodal coherence is something that, in thinking about Alan's contribution to anthropology, he's really brought across the field in a context for an anthropologist. We're sort of saying, no, cultures aren't wholes. Oh, they're all fragmentary, and this kind of, that sort of careful multimodal, provisional coherence. It was really great to hear you explicate that, which, yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, and that's very nice to hear that it, see that kind of an approach sort of plays out on the anthropological side. And when you describe that, it makes me think a lot actually of our joint teacher, Paul Friedrich, who always had that kind of an idea of open-endedness and of ferment that basically is built into the juxtapositions and relations that you get in language, and if you look for them, I think in culture probably too.
I should also say that throughout the day, I think we should have a sort of double-headed discussion structure, since the day is in Alan's honour. So a lot of the questions will both be to the speaker and to Alan.
Yeah, that's
some
absolutely.
sense. So
Yeah,
I don't know,
yeah,
Alan,
yeah.
if you want to say anything to that, and we'll take that as a general procedure as well.
About this?
About Deb's question and
Yeah.
some of the general issue.
Well, I think that's right. So it's like, a lot of stuff that has gone on in anthropology in the last 20 years is basically like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, inventing this idea of the past in anthropology as having been one where people acted as if cultures were totally coherent, bounded, persistent entities. And when you conclude that they're not, you sort of throw everything to the wind. But actually, that same thing is true of linguistics to some extent. But I think linguists are more open to different ways of looking at language, some of which constitute it as a relatively coherent and bounded system. Saussure himself did this when he invented the modern concept of law. He said, it's not that this thing exists out there. I have invented a way of looking at the range of of speech phenomena that will allow us to study it as if it were a coherent and bounded system. And of course, he has another long chapter on dialectology and shows from this other point of view, no, there are no natural boundaries around this thing we're calling language. There's just a continuum from one end of northern France to the other end of Italy and so forth.
It's the point of view that creates the object.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Great lines. I've got one about time, which I would like to continue because both to you and to Alan again. In a way, the more one finds these harmonies between, let's say, a linguistic ideology and a feature of lexical grammar, or between oratorical structure, such as you just showed with the progression from lying, sitting on the ground, sitting on a platform and standing, and a little set of verbs in that variety of chatina. The more you find that harmony, the more it raises the question, which pushes which first, and how. Because you've still got to transition between states, and you've still got to have mismatches as well, because no system is perfectly tuned. And what do you both think about, firstly, how one recognises when those less than pleasant or less than harmonious situations exist, and whether both directions of causality are in play, and how one can identify that?
I mean, I would think ideally you would find as many, you'd look at examples of new juxtapositions and see which budges first, basically. See if so for example, the multiples of two system budged when the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost came along. And so that's one type of an example. Other examples would be ones where you somehow manage to knock that into a bunch of couplets.
So they didn't sort of refashion their whole traditional oratorical structure in the way of Dante to have sort of tercets and triplets and so on, which like it just takes the Trinity and projects it into metrics as far as is possible, but you just uncomfortably accommodate one little triplet into a basically double structure. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it's got to go in both directions. I would be careful not to try to ever see these things in one direction.
But I think parallelism is a great example, a great fertile field for exploring this kind of relative coherence, relative persistence of given ways of doing things. Like in, Jakobson treated it as basically binaristic, but this material from Central America shows, no, this stuff is, you saw those repetitions of more than two, but there is a clustering of stuff around 4, I would guess, and the number 4 has a tremendous, importance and widespread cosmological significance in the southwest of the U.S. and down the, whereas in the beginning of the cluster, part of the highlands, they cluster around 2. It is precisely parallelism, but a pairing, parallelism of pairs, but of particular kinds of semantic relations, not ones of class inclusion, as you find in some Mayan stuff, or some Jim Fox's canonical forms of parallelism. I clutch it to my body, I clutch it to my chest, where the second is a more specific one. Instead, you bring together often wildly, seemingly disparate things together and explore what new insights will be revealed by bringing together this thing and that thing that you thought was so different.
Jim, since there are a lot of Foxy references flying around at the moment, do you want to say something?
No, I'll stay out of it.
Just a question about the relationship between your work on child language and this notion of genius of languages. So maybe
Yeah, well, I don't use the, I mean, I haven't, maybe I've been inspired by Sapir's ideas about it, but I haven't used the word genius itself. But I find this, in general, Tony's talk a revelation to me, because I didn't really recognize this talk about persistence, and you know, you're picking out a strand of my work that makes it look, to me, maybe now, I hadn't realized how coherent it was. But I think, but this stuff about parallelism and the way that it creates implicit what the Oxford calls relations of equivalence is a great example of a kind of a language function or a way of speaking that enters into interactions with children and that inculcates understandings of the way the world is without actually referring to or codifying them explicitly. Well, like, we all are familiar with things. It used to be the case when somebody said, well, I have an appointment with a doctor today. What's his name? Assuming that it is a male.
Yeah.
So there are kinds of parallelisms that set up that sort of assumption, that underlying assumption that are not explicitly codified.
But if you want to think of some of the areas in which that parallelism that Alan is talking about, that pairing is relevant, you can think about the way in which tribes are paired, for example, that you mentioned, Tony. You can think about the way in which words are paired. Pig-dog is a classic pairing to talk about things that are inimical to each other. Then you can talk about the way people are paired. So a pair of brothers, for example, may be called Uwa and Simanji, which is the different frames of the house. So they're paired as the
vertical column and
the
the
vertical and the
cross
crossbeam of the house. And so people absorb all this. I mean, maybe that's part of the answer to the question. They absorb all these things in these different modalities. But they don't necessarily explicitly say pairing. It's more the background to how they understand things and how they understand that relation to the other boy, for example.
But there is an expression of making twos that people literally means putting things together and making twos.
It's a style of thinking, in a way.
It's a style
and
of
it
thinking.
allows you to sort of open up new ideas.
Yeah. So that was actually a theme, a meta theme of our conference, comparing aspects of indigenous Australia and indigenous Papua New Guinea that resulted in the book that we showed. Yeah. We're not in the first instance necessarily looking at any kind of historical continuity between the two, direct contact, but what can we learn, what additional insight can we get about each of them by putting them together and seeing what kind of a pair it forms. An odd couple, perhaps.
Well, we have another pairing here. You put two boys from Chicago together and they come up with some new openings, new insights. That's good.
We'll have another Chicago axis pairing that will vary the gender
Yes,
later in the afternoon.
that's right.
Yeah. So look, this is now the time for lunch. So let's take this opportunity to thank Tony for a magnificent introduction.